Airing first on Asheville FM, 103.3 WSFM LP in Asheville, North Carolina, this is The Final Straw Radio, a weekly anarchist and anti-authoritarian podcast and broadcast emanating from occupied Saligi land in southern Appalachia. We bring you voices from the long struggle towards liberation from around the world. Welcome. This week you'll hear Kieran and Marco of the Angry Workers, a collective of anti-authoritarian communists struggling to think through and build workers' autonomy from the UK. For the hour, they talk about their organizing and the book they just published, Class Power on 0 Hours, available in the US by PM Press and currently 50% off if purchased from the publisher. Over 6 years, the Angry Workers got jobs in far West London in factories, warehouses, and logistics, building relationships with coworkers and neighbors from origins worldwide, and getting their hands dirty building working class power alongside other precarious and gig workers. The book documents attempts at building a solidarity network, their newspaper to open dialogue called Workers' Wild West, and engagements in workplace actions and organizing. They worked inside and outside of trade unions and the IWW, assessing victories, defeats, and lessons to move forward with, and sharing glimpses into the struggles and ideas of the people they worked and lived around. This book is an amazingly detailed exploration of building solidarity, learning from mistakes, and working towards a collective vision for liberation amongst the laboring classes at the points of production and reproduction. And now a quick announcement. Incarcerated journalist and author Jason Bernard Walker, Minister of Labor for the new African Black Panther Party prison chapter, will have a parole hearing coming up soon in Texas. Jason has faced serious backlash from white supremacist gangs and guards due to his activism and reporting while held by the TDCJ. So much so that he was recently transferred to a new prison, apparently because of threats he was facing at Clements Unit. Jason's book, about which we got to interview him back in April, reports from within the belly of the beast, torture and injustice inside the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, is now available in paperback as well as digital via Amazon, and his writings have regularly been published on the SF Bayview National Black Newspaper's website and in print. Letters of support for his parole will go a long way towards getting the parole board to release Jason so that he can finish his federal stint and get back to the outside. You can check our show notes for details on where to write and suggestions of content. And now some words from anarchist prisoner Sean Swain.
What you say, what you say, what you say, what? We're caught like a fly!
Well, it appears that Canada doesn't want me. Lauren lives in Canada. You know, that country north of the United States. They're a Canadian citizen. We figured if we got married, I would be a shoo-in for Canadian citizenship. But apparently not. Apparently, since I have a felony conviction, there's a long and expensive process for applying for citizenship. And even then, there's only like a 50-50 shot at getting approved. Canada, it seems, is pretty selective about who they let into their country. Well, selective enough to keep me out. I tried another angle, too. I currently have a claim pending in international courts against the United States for politically motivated domestic torture. My OAS testimony is posted online at swainrocks.org and seanswain.org. So in that case, I requested that the OAS arrange for me to get political asylum in a member state nation. Canada is a member state of the OAS. So I contacted Canada to apply for political asylum. The unofficial response that Lauren got was, Canada won't grant political asylum against the US. Very disappointing. I was doing research and studying up to be a good Canadian. I watched hockey on the weekends, and I figured out the icing penalty. I learned Canadian cuisine. Ever heard of poutine? Poutine is a plate full of French fries covered in gravy and cheese curds. It's a staple of the It's a staple of the diet in Canada. For government, they have a parliamentary system with a prime minister. They're small s socialist, paying like 50% of their pay in taxes. When I told Lauren that Canada is socialist, they shared with me that it's mandatory for every Canadian home to have a poster of Marx and a small shrine for daily rituals. That's one reason the maple leaf on their flag is red. The reason? It's bathed in the blood of their enemies. Yeah, that's supposed to be funny, you know, because it's Canada. It kinda hurts my feelings that Canada doesn't want me. I'm a nice enough guy. People like me. It's my sparkling personality. Growing up in the Detroit area, I had lots of experience with Canada. When I was about 5, my parents took me across the border, not knowing it was Canadian Thanksgiving. Turns out they do Thanksgiving in October. Who knew? So everything was closed except for a porn shop. I was 5. All I could see were the covers of the books, but it was enough. The next day I showed my parents my crayon drawings of naked women, thanks to Canadian Thanksgiving at the dirty bookstore. In high school, I got kicked out of Canada 3 times in one night. 2 other delinquents and I tried to cross the bridge, and when we got questioned at the border, we seemed like 3 teens trying to use fake IDs to get into Canadian topless bars. You know why? Because we were three teens trying to use fake IDs to get into Canadian topless bars. We got refused, so we came back half an hour later. The original border agent saw my car and got me pulled over. They searched the car and found a dime bag of pot in the glove compartment and a pair of nunchaku under the seat. We got turned back again. They even let us keep the pot. So we ended up going through the tunnel. We got into the topless bar, but I got us kicked out. A waitress had test tubes of free drinks asking if we wanted sex on the beach or other drinks like orgasm or blowjob. I told her no thank you, as I didn't want to drink an orgasm out of a test tube. When she said she would, I asked for her phone number. Her boyfriend was a bouncer. We were escorted to the parking lot. When I was in 6th grade, we took a field trip to Toronto. That was kind of cool. I bought souvenirs, rubber fake vomit, rubber fake dog poop, and a boomerang. I'll tell you this, if you want realistic fake vomit or dog poop, Canada is the place to get it. That is some of the most realistic fake vomit or dog poop I've ever seen. Impressive. Canadian workmanship is excellent. But since Canada doesn't want me as a citizen, I feel like I have no allegiance and so have to be perfectly honest. The Canadian boomerang was totally defective. I threw that fucking thing 1,000 times. In the yard, at the park, a few times in the living room, and it never came back, not once. Know what you call a boomerang that never comes back? A stick. So if you go to Canada, buy up all the fake vomit and dog poop you can find, but don't trust those Canadian boomerangs. They're a swindle. In fact, since I'm not getting accepted into Canada, and Lauren now has to emigrate to the US, I think I'm going to write Prime Minister Justin Trudeau a very tersely worded letter about his country's immigration policies and their defective boomerangs. Something's got to be done. This is Anarchist Prisoner Nausnosh, which is not Sean Swain spelled backwards. If you're listening, you are the resistance.
You can write to Sean Swain at his latest address at Sean Swain, number 2015638, Buckingham Correctional, P.O. Box 430, Dillwyn, Virginia, 23936. You can find his past writings, recordings of his audio segments, and updates on his case at seanswain.org, or now follow him on Twitter at @SwainRocks. Would you care to introduce yourselves with whatever names and pronouns or anything else you want to say about yourself for the audience?
Hi, my name's Kiran. I use a pronoun she, her, and I've been in Angry Workers for about 6 or 7 years, and for most of that time I was working in a food factory, which I write about in the book and that you'll hear more about during this interview. Yeah, and we wrote a book called Class Power on 0 Hours, and it's available for everyone to buy right now. And PM Press are also doing a 50% offer, which ends in January. So if you want to buy it, then now's the time to buy it. And we'll talk a bit about the book in this interview as well.
All right, that's the advertisement done.
Sorry.
All right.
Well, and for anyone who's like at the outset, say they have to cut out early or whatever, and they want to get a little like deeper taste of it, you've got like the introduction and like a few videos and some of the other writings up on our website, right?
Yeah, that's right. If you go on www.classpower.net, we've got the introduction is there, so you can read the first chapter of the book for free. And we've got a list of people that have reviewed the book with and links to their reviews, so people can get kind of flavour of what it's about.
Yeah, and I'm Marco, he, him, and part of Angry Workers. And I worked as a delivery driver for 4 years, and before that in warehouses and a 3D printer factory, manufacturing plant.
Just for the 3D printer factory, were you manufacturing 3D printers, or were you applying the process of 3D printing?
No, we were assembling 3D printers, and we were recycling print ink cartridges, and it was like a factory of about 200 people doing that.
It's a total bad joke, but don't they have printers to make the printers?
Yeah, you would think so, that they just print themselves, but that is actually a very lengthy process. So even we use like 4 parts printed 3D with our own printers, but that I think the little plastic part, would come to about £1.50 or something, because it would take so long. So the luxury communism is not here yet.
And thus the essentialism of workers' role in the economy, which is the platform of this conversation. Can you talk about how the Angry Workers Collective formed, how many of you were in it at the outset of this process that you talk about in writing the book, and sort of what shared political perspectives you had?
Should we return to our origins?
Yeah.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, at the beginning it was mainly Kieran and me. We were involved in, the central London left organization. I was in a libertarian communist platformist organization called the Commune, and you, Kieran, were
In a feminist organisation called Feminist Fight Back.
And these are good organizations. They do their work, but at the same time we thought it's very much campaign oriented. You've got meetings, you go to protests, you have got publication, but I felt at least that we lacked the roots in the working class. I mean, I was working at the time as a cleaner on the housing estate, so there were about like 100 cleaners of that company, but it didn't feel like that there was much dynamic. It was like you were part of daily life of working class people for sure, but we thought, we want to move out towards the western fringe of London, where you find many logistics companies and food manufacturing. So that was 2 of us. We had one comrade, friend who was already working here in a warehouse. So he kind of introduced us to the area a bit more. At the same time, we had friends, 2 comrades from Poland who were active in Workers' Initiative, which is a syndicalist organization, who are now very, successfully organizing at Amazon in Poland. And they came over because partly to work with us, partly to have a job. Like, we were all looking for jobs. So it was easy to find in West London. You find a job any day. And yeah, I think that was the onset to find a politics that's more related to working class, where the working class has some structural power, despite, and we can talk about that later, individual vulnerability. I mean, there's many migrant workers here, a lot of women workers. So, but the tension between having collective power and being individually in a weak position, we thought that's our starting point.
And I think we also kind of thought we need to start from like what workers are already doing, and you can kind of find that out by maybe interviewing them or trying to hang around and talk to them and ask them questions, but you only ever really kind of know, I guess, if you're on the inside, because if you're kind of asking people questions, why should they trust you? It's very difficult to kind of build a relationship that way. It's very hard, and we've tried that as well, and so it just seemed to make more sense to think, okay, well, we're interested in logistics, we're interested in kind of new methods of organisation, what's happening inside these warehouses, how is capitalism working at the moment, and we wanted first-hand experience of that, so we were looking for jobs, and so it was a kind of political decision to decide, okay, well, let's get jobs in places that we find politically interesting, and that was the kind of main criteria for picking our jobs. that and the kind of, there had to be kind of bigger workplaces. So not just kind of, 5 or 6 people, but somewhere where we could really kind of meet lots of people, and there was kind of more potential for doing stuff.
Yeah, which also explains a bit the political, let's say, perspective that we share, which is like, it's working class self-organization, the daily struggle and the experiences that workers make, the starting point to discuss a different society, and self-organization happens depending on the conditions that you find yourself in. So it doesn't really work to come with a predetermined organizational model. All these models have to adjust to the way that production process is organized, the way that workers are already forming groups or communities, and the previous experiences in that region. So all this has to be taken into account. So our starting point is that we encourage our co-workers to take their time and analyze what our conditions are and find new ways to struggle, because the old ways, the old mode of struggle has come to an impasse. And that is a political process. That's not just like trying to find the better tools for organizing. It's really like the starting point of taking our lives serious again, also on a political level. Like, why is our life like it is? Why is the industry organized like it is? Why is food coming from, the global south and is flown in through Heathrow and ending in our warehouse, although you could grow that here as well? All these kind of questions are part of a political process, and it's part of the organizing process. So this combination, we thought, is lacking in most of the left organizations. You would either have Labour kind of left in the UK, who are looking electoral politics and seeing workers mainly as either represented just as members of trade unions or voting citizens, or you've got the more like radical left, which is often a bit sectarian, ideological. And we thought we start from scratch.
This is The Final Straw, and you're listening to my conversation with Kieran and Marco of Angry Workers. It kind of sounds like both of those approaches that you're describing that you experience in the left, with the labor side was sort of like looking at regular working people as sort of like numbers, and maybe the other, like the radical left, sort of looking at, you said sectarians, is sort of like turned in on themselves. Is that kind of a like, those are critiques that I've definitely heard of, in the US, Democrat related, like leftism or social democracy, like people sort of like pushing towards the electoral approach, or just sort of like anarchists being anarchists and not really engaging too much with regular people without the labels.
Yeah, I think that's pretty.
Yeah, you find that here. Yeah.
Kieran, you sort of like, you mentioned the book and gave like a brief overview, but can you give a little more detail as to like what one could find in the book, what brought y'all to write it, and this is directed at both of you, and sort of who the expected audience is for it? I know that y'all were seeking some feedback on it. Have you gotten very much?
Yeah, I mean, we've had some thoughtful reviews asking critical and, interesting questions. I think what we would also appreciate is maybe groups who discuss the book, or groups like actually involved in a kind of organising or political process, and they read the book together, like what they would think about the book and comparing it to their own kind of perspectives and experiences, and what they think about organisation. We haven't had much of that, I don't think, and that would be quite useful. But we also have to kind of give people time to read the book, because I think in America it only came out like in August or middle of August, because it took quite a while, what with Corona and everything. Just also to say that, it wasn't always our plan to write a book. We always wanted to document what we were doing in West London. So everything we did, like all the stuff we did at work, all of our observations, our attempts at organising, our solidarity network, we wanted to be quite open and transparent about that process of trying to organise, especially, as we said, there was only kind of 2 of us right at the very beginning, and then there was 4 of us for quite a while. So there weren't many of us, and yet we were trying to do quite a lot of stuff. And we wanted to document all that, also as a way of kind of inviting people to join us. So then about 5 years in, we had quite a lot of information already and stuff that we had published. And we thought, okay, well, we could kind of bring all of this together in a book. But also because at that point, we wanted more of a exchange, I guess, with other groups. And we thought we had the nuts and bolts of a kind of idea for organisation at that point, because we tried a lot of things and we thought we had a kind of workable model, and we wanted to write about that and put that out there and see what other people thought of it. So it was also a way of trying to meet other groups who were interested in what we were doing and maybe doing similar things, and start that international and even national exchange. Because I think over the 6 or 7 years we became quite, like involved. It's like involving to do the Solidarity Network and like be at work all day, and like there's a lot of stuff going on. And the trick is to, remain focused on that, but also always having an eye to what's happening outside of that context and sharing that. So the book was a way that we did that.
Yeah. And to walk you through the book, like the first part is introducing the area a bit, which is the outskirts of West London, the so-called Western Corridor. You've got two major inroads to London, which is Europe's biggest town. And you've got Europe's biggest airport just here, that's Heathrow. And a lot of the food, basically, that's consumed in London, about 60% is either packaged here or, processed, or, often you've got the big supermarkets, warehouses, distribution centers here, and food processing plants. So in all, we can talk like about 200,000 mainly manual workers in logistics and food processing. And you've got about 80%, 90% of them are migrant workers, Eastern Europe or South Asia. And our first steps are documented in the sense that, we describe the best way to start is like to get a job in these places, start, experiencing how the work is organized and what your co-workers think about it, what their main problems are. And that was our first step. So we described that a bit. There's the small, more informal steps that you take after you've get a better overview of your workplace. So we describe an overtime boycott after the bosses tried to cut the agency bonus for overtime. So it was like an informal action. Another one was a slowdown in a supermarket warehouse. So that's documented at the beginning as, for some, also to share the experience of working in bigger warehouses. From there, we look at the Solidarity Network, and that's basically an attempt to address the issue that a lot of workers arrive here are dependent on their so-called community, meaning if they come from South Asia, the English might not be the best, so they depend on Indian middle-class people who are either landlords or bosses to have the first steps in the new country, are often overexploited. So let's say the bosses of their community take advantage of their dependency. And the Solidarity Network tried to address that, the fact that we are often isolated. But we didn't want to do case-by-case work because that's normally what's happening when you just do like a Solidarity Network based on individual problems. So we encourage people who attended or came to us to look at their current work and what kind of problems and potentials are there. We said that in the end, it's not about us just being able to pressure your former boss, but it's about creating a network big enough so that we can take steps at work where we are today. So we described the Solidarity Network, some of the problems and some of the positive elements.
We talk about the newspaper, so we have a publication. Mm-hmm. So we talk about the role of a newspaper, what it should be doing, what we try to do with it, and then we also have a chapter on working class women. So we interviewed like 5 women that we knew, that we'd maybe worked with or that we'd lived with, and just talked to them about their experiences of work and life. And we also kind of published that as a little pamphlet for International Women's Day. But we kind of talk in more general as well about like pressures of working class families in the area. And then, the main kind of middle section of the book is 3 workers' inquiries, where we go very kind of in depth into 3 of the workplaces that we worked in and talk about, what we did on the job, but also kind of where this workplace fit in to a kind of bigger global context, really. So just to give a sense of like where the workers and the workforce kind of fit in like the larger scheme of things. Because as I said before, you can kind of be very busy like doing your shop floor organising and stuff, but unless you are kind of seeing where you are in the bigger scheme of things, you're going to be limited in terms of what you think is possible to do.
Yeah, and there was another chapter that we forgot, which is about syndicalism and the IWW. So I think we mentioned at the beginning that our starting point is workers analyzing their condition and finding ways to organize based on that. And we engaged in informal actions on the job, like which were informal, sometimes not even clearly visible. In a different situation, we thought like the IWW might be a way to introduce a union or as a vehicle to engage in a wage struggle. So like as a legal vehicle.
If people don't know, IWW is the Industrial Workers of the World, which is a kind of small, rank and file union.
That's right. Yeah. So we described the campaign. We had like contacts in about 10 different factories. We knew roughly about the conditions, and we try to introduce the IWW mainly from the outside, which is always a bit of a weak position. And we describe the problems in that campaign. And in the workplace description, we also, we set up an independent factory newsletter in these food factories where Karen worked. And there were 3 other comrades who worked there at the time. So it's like an independent group. We also describe the problems with that. And in 2 situations, we decided to become shop stewards with the official union. And so that would be, basically a decision that we reflected on, because in general we think the trade unions have their limitations. They're often more stifling than anything else. But under these circumstances, we thought, okay, we try to see if there's scope for, widening the scope of self-organization. Yeah.
And then we end with a more kind of political, I guess, discussion about what would revolution, what would it mean today? How can we kind of imagine a revolution unfolding? What would need to happen? The role of essential industries in maintaining a revolutionary impetus, and we kind of drill down and look into like what these essential industries are in the UK as a kind of case study, and it's a kind of way of I guess rescuing revolution from this kind of utopian ideal or some kind of insurrectionist heaven, and actually making it a kind of a real possibility, and kind of getting realer in the sense of, I think a lot of people, especially during Corona, have realised that it doesn't take that many of us to keep the world from going, or to keep ourselves fed and clothed and with a roof over our head and like our phones charged and all of these things. And this kind of mystification, I guess, that is normally around, where you don't think that that it would require some kind of like massive change that is just totally impossible. I think with Corona, those kind of levels of mystification were diminished, and people could it became a bit more kind of possible. So anyway, we wrote this just before Corona happened, but actually in the new edition of the book we have an introduction about Corona and how that's changed things. And that's also something that we're kind of grappling with at the moment, like how has Corona changing like class relations, I guess, in a wider sense, but also like on the shop floor, how are things different? now that workers maybe have a bit more of a sense of confidence and knowing that, they're actually important in the wider kind of economy and scheme of things, like how does that translate to a confidence at work, or does it? And I think we can't really take that for granted, because even though there are more strikes happening, and we've read that as well in the US, I think that there was kind of hundreds of these strikes kind of recorded, although I don't know really that much about them, but or what they managed to achieve. And I think the same thing is happening also in the UK. Like, we're talking about the new winter of discontent, where you've got these very big companies all voting for strike. I mean, that you can kind of say, that's good. Workers are kind of doing something, and there's some kind of beast waking up. But I think you also you can't take these things on face value, because you don't really know what the quality of that strike is, whether workers are even involved, and it's this idea of kind of getting behind the scenes to find out actually what is going on. What does it mean? What do strikes mean nowadays? I think all of these are quite pertinent issues, and ones that we raise in the book through our experiences as well.
This is The Final Straw, and you're listening to my conversation with Kieran and Marco of Angry Workers. While the book has been published, this is, I guess, in contrast to a lot of experimentation that leftists will make sometimes into what working class reality is. You're continuing to live your lives. You're continuing to work and continue building the relationships with folks throughout, as the crisis deepens with COVID.
Yeah. We try to focus more on building a network that is UK-wide. That's something that we didn't manage while we were, intensively working in West London. But at the moment, for example, we try to establish a group at Heathrow Airport. There's one comrade, he's been working there a long time as a maintenance mechanic. And at the moment, there's a very full-on attack on the aviation sector and the workers there. It's basically they force people to basically fire and rehire, and expecting workers to sign contracts with including pay cuts and everything. So we try to organize a newsletter around that, organize meetings, which is not easy under lockdown conditions. Other comrades started things in south of London, and we continue. But I think we have to reanalyze the condition under the pandemic. I mean, we, as Kieran said, we could see that the essential workers, which everyone clapped for and said, oh yeah, you're heroes, but that's maybe 40% of the workforce. They pulled society through these kind of let's say natural calamity, although we know that it's not just a natural occurrence, it's has a lot to do with society. But to make the contrast a bit starker, I mean, we managed to pull through this pandemic, and then now these workers are suffering from a man-made crisis, which is the economic crisis. And now are supposed to accept job cuts and wage cuts. What do we do in that situation? And I think the left in general is a bit outside of that. We would ask the question, is there a scope to rediscuss the question of workers' control? I mean, a lot of workers were asking themselves, do I risk my life for something that is really not, that's bullshit? Do I work under conditions when I know that the product is really worthless? So I think there was a lot of organic discussion about, how is production organized? Why do we do these jobs? And now we've got a situation where, despite years where they told us, we've got automation, we've got all these, productive technologies, and now all of a sudden you see an attack on wages and on jobs that will leave so many more people in poverty, while on the background of a decade of discussion how productive society is. So these kind of contrasts and contradictions really open very wide. But to discuss them, you can't just do that on YouTube. So that was our idea of a workers' newspaper that combines the day-to-day documentation of our experiences and struggles, but also throws in idea about, a very pragmatic idea about, why is this society so contradictory, and is there a way to think about a different society? I mean, yeah, that's our main aim really in this current situation.
Yeah, so in the earlier chapters of the book, you lay out a lot of examples, and I imagine they're coming from what you published in, it was Wild Wild West, right?
Workers Wild West.
Workers Wild West. Excuse me. I was thinking of the movie.
Will Smith.
It's catchy, though. It stays in your head.
Yeah.
But there are a number of experiences that are shared in these sort of like paragraph-long, slightly anonymized, but yet in that like universal descriptions of people's experiences with like problems that they're facing in the workplace or in their household or in their with community organizations or what have you, with their landlords. You did the work of listening to people's experiences, documenting it. I'd imagine like disseminating a lot of that through the newspaper, because like if you're going to have a conversation about the universality of, or the almost universality of the class as being a real thing, people have to be able to understand the common threads that tie us to it, the actual experiences of it that draws out and away from like the neoliberal customer subject or whatever in society. And you also did a lot of like setting up these clinics or these times, as was mentioned earlier, where you would like sit in a cafe or in a community space, like a labor space or whatever, and sort of listen to people's experiences. Some of this stuff can be shared in a workplace, but oftentimes if you've got a manager breathing down your back, that's difficult. And also, people don't necessarily, after a long day at work and a long commute ahead of them, and maybe family to take care of at home, hang around and with the same people they've been around for 12 hours or 8 hours to talk about their issues. So how have you found the space and ability to continue having these conversations with your coworkers since the pandemic has shifted things?
Since the pandemic, I mean, I shifted to a different town actually because my kids moved there. So I have mainly been in touch with my workmates or former workmates through phone and WhatsApp and these kind of things. So I think in terms of the pandemic and discussion during the pandemic, that was pretty much interrupted. But maybe more general about that point. I mean, we had the problem of people having very little time. So, we tried, for example, we have this weekly solidarity network meetings, and we tried to have a monthly social meeting where we had the idea, all people who, we've been in touch with, who, develop friendships. It's about like 30 people. Working class people in the area. So once a month we would come together and do a mix of, socializing, eating, maybe watch some documentaries, kind of little bits about struggles somewhere else, talk about our problems or just chat. But even that was difficult to establish because, of the, current way that shifts are organized, the fact that workers are, are pretty tired. But I wouldn't extend that. I think it has something to do as well with having the confidence that this will change something. I mean, we were here during the 6 years that we were here. We had maybe 3 or 4 strikes, and that was not in the food manufacturing or logistics sector. That was mainly in the already organized, more like transport or teachers or other kind of public sector workers. So we all our experience happened on the background that up to now these 200,000 low-wage workers didn't manage to find the confidence. Why was that? I mean, there are certain things that you find in the workplace, kind of certain divisions, other issues. But there's a lot that works from outside the workplace. I mean, that was the time of Brexit, where you wouldn't know how that would turn out, and you still don't know. So it would affect all those people from, Eastern European countries. You had, an increasing situation of economic crisis, which didn't translate into job cuts here yet, but like now with the pandemic, it does. You had a situation of domestic work for a lot of female workers, women workers, where we also, and we did that in the newspaper and we document that in the book, try to say like we live under overcrowded conditions. We are, let's say, 10 people in a house that was built for a nuclear family. And the left might find that shocking or bad, but we could also turn it around and say like, okay, we share involuntarily our kitchen and whatever with other families or with other workers. How can we turn that around and make our domestic life easier? So instead of just seeing it as something, oh, these poor people, I mean, we lived under these conditions as well. We shared with other families. But how can we maybe collectivize certain tasks and make the so-called private sphere, which you don't really have if you live next to each other on the same floor? How can we, give each other space and at the same time support each other and kind of relate to that? So yeah, these kind of things, we try to open little spaces for collectivity that would then allow us to have more strength and time maybe to organize. And that's how we organized our lives as well. I mean, we were living with comrades and tried to support each other practically, emotionally and all that.
The Final Straw is a proud member of the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts, and here's a jingle from another member of CZN.
You're listening to Dissident Island Radio.
Live every first and third Friday of the month at 9 p.m. GMT.
Check out www.dissidentisland.org for downloads and more.
Yeah, that kind of reminds me of the chapter about the experiences of women that y'all had a chance to talk to, where it talks about the stresses oftentimes of living with partners, maybe having families also, and the stresses that are put specifically on female assigned workers and community members. And when like relationships are constructed within at least within like the Anglo-American world, heterosexual relationships, monogamous relationships, especially I'm sure during a time of economic difficulties, where people are forced to share smaller and smaller spaces, those relationships sort of become the primary way of getting all of the sort of support that an individual can find in the world, or it can feel that way. The discussion of the importance of these sort of like, not necessarily the one that you've been working on, the Solidarity Network that way, but the expansion of solidarity and community bounds past just the like nuclear family, the importance for relieving tensions, for allowing other aspects of support for individuals, and sort of, yeah, I don't know, that I found that really interesting. I found that chapter very useful.
Yeah, and we can say that all these things, you can try to gradually build them, and solidarity networks, groups at work and all that, but I think we shouldn't underestimate that, especially in a situation of concrete struggle or strikes. These things, like, they make a leap forward. I mean, what you thought you wouldn't be able to achieve, to day-to-day kind of organizing, is all of a sudden comes to the fore when workers take the step. We had situations here of gate gourmet workers, like airline catering workers. They were locked out, and that was like, I don't know, up to 600, mainly women workers, mainly from Punjab. And obviously there was the whole, structure that they had, like friends, families, the temple, and so on, that was there during nearly 1 year of lockout, where, you had food kitchens and you had, support, basically. These kind of things, they emerge often very, spontaneous and organically. But then this strike also was beaten. So it is still there, and this was when, in 2004, 5 or something, like 15 years ago. So in both of our workplaces, they're big workplaces with, let's say, several thousand people. This experience of that strike and that lockdown is still there in many people's minds, or is passed on as one experience. What happens if you take on a big company, that you get locked out and basically lose your job, and that the trade union might also sell you out. So on one hand, we see like solidarity brings you quite far, but then it also becomes a question of, do you have the political, let's say, clarity? Do you understand how these trade unions work? Do you understand how these big global corporations like Gate Gourmet work? Are you prepared for the fact that management is prepared? I mean, management basically incited a strike by bringing in Eastern European female agency workers, who were then posed against the Indian permanent workers. So if you're not able to understand that, management has a strategy, what is our strategy, then all the solidarity of the world will only, get you so far. So this is why, we emphasize that we need a workers' science, we need a workers' self-analysis, and that is, it's not an abstract thing. It's very concrete when you need it and why you need it.
And I think a lot of time and effort went into trying to kind of create spaces where workers could come together and just talk honestly and openly about their situation. So at work, I tried to organise meetings just for women workers, and I even invited like some older women who were involved in strikes, even in the 70s. And, they're the same background to the women that I was working with, like same language and cultural background, with the idea of like, okay, they could kind of bring some, a kind of idea that you could do something differently, and that they actually did do something, and they went out on the streets, and it was this kind of formative experience, and just kind of giving the idea that was possible to do. But it was really difficult to get women to come, because all the kind of structural reasons, and they've got to look after their kids, and also kind of culturally, like they wouldn't kind of just come to a meeting because it's not kind of the normal thing to do. And it was just so it sounds like quite a small thing, just like be able to have a space where people can come together and feel like it's productive and they can talk openly and honestly. And it's such a tiny thing, but it's just so massively important.
No, I mean, this would be part of a whole, let's say, infrastructure, we discussed, part of our, let's say, collective effort was like having reading groups. So we read like Mike Davis, where he tries to see what was the strengths of the working class, historically. And it was always to have, this combination of, solidarity, material solidarity kind of structures, have industrial power, and have some kind of political environment, like an organization that encourage workers to, think on an international dimension, because, the enemy is organized internationally, the system works internationally, to encourage to have a historical view. So for us, these are all kind of things that somehow, once you get a dynamic between these different levels, it might be at first just a defensive struggle, mutual aid. It might be that, out of that comes more confidence at work. You have a strike situation. Only that then kind of creates also the space for people to discuss bigger pictures. You don't want to discuss like a utopia when you feel like down, because that makes your situation even worse. So only once you have a collective confidence, let's say political issues become more pressing or like debatable. So we try to, start like building this kind of infrastructure, and at the same time also document that for a debate that can be led internationally. So that's probably the main, looking back maybe a bit self-critically, is that we maybe try to do too many things at the same time. You could say, like, if we had just focused on a tenants union, or had just focused on this one factory and try to have a wage campaign there, and for all our limited capacity go into that, you might have had like a so-called presentable success. But I think for us it was important to see it's kind of a holistic kind of understanding of organization that would encompass all these different elements. So also to contribute to a revolutionary debate, to encourage our co-workers to take part in political meetings. So that was possible. I mean, some of our warehouse colleagues came to an international Amazon workers meeting. I mean, all these kind of things that we thought the left is lacking. So that's why we decided to do maybe too many things and nothing proper. But yeah, you can judge yourself reading the book.
I guess it's like a difficulty of doing prefigurative work, like trying to create the organs that would help you struggle, to have them in place so that you can do the struggle.
Yeah, exactly.
This is The Final Straw, and you're listening to my conversation with Kieran and Marco of Angry Workers. What's your so the experience that I have mostly talking to folks like who do working class work? Most of the people that I know, most of them are in service industry jobs, and most of them don't really want to stay doing that work. They want to move on to a different position. They don't have any like investment of making that workplace better or building relationships with their coworkers. They just kind of want to keep their head down. I mean, that seems pretty legit, but when there were people in the workplaces that you were interacting with who were expressing that position, like what sort of things how did the conversation go in terms of your idea that like if every job is all going to be a crap job that you're just trying to get out of, like why wouldn't you just stick and fight somewhere?
Job. I mean, some jobs are like that in it. But like I think with the jobs that we were in, there was always a core of people who were in these jobs like long time. I mean, the women that you worked with, they were there for 15 years, partly because they had no other chance.
Yeah. So the question there is not really to, you don't have to kind of convince them of sticking around. They've just become so jaded, and they've been around for so long that they've kind of lost all hope, and there's just kind of despair and too much experience in a way for them to kind of think, that things could be different. So that was kind of my main issue, was to try and say, well, okay, yeah, things are really rubbish, and you have to kind of respect that opinion because their experiences are totally like legitimate and valid, and if I'd have been working there for 20 years then I probably would have felt the same.
Yeah, but it's also obviously something to do with the nature of the job. I mean, where I worked, there was like 1,400 people delivering shopping to people's homes, but I would say at least half of it was like to offices of financial companies, and they wanted their hummus and a bit of fresh fruit and some champagne for the manager, and you think you're just an asshole who just brings that stuff to some rich bankers. But the other part of the job is like bring it to older people or to elderly care homes, to nurseries. So something where you think, that actually makes sense. And you're always in this kind of contradiction because, for the company, it's just like, they're interested in the profit. On the other hand, there's a social dimension of your job, which is never the priority. So we always get frustrated about that element. And I think, especially now in the pandemic, that's something that we have to put in the discussion. I mean, obviously, they enforce on us an attack on wages and on jobs, and we're put in a position that we want to defend the job at all costs. That's what we have at Heathrow as well. They say like, okay, we're going to cut these jobs. Do we want to defend jobs in the aviation industry if we know that 1% of the population, all these kind of business flights destroy our climate and life for future generations? That's the contradiction we're in. So there you have to kind of find a way that on one hand you defend the conditions that you have, and at the same time you open some space for debate about what sense does it make. Don't just accept a job because you've got it. I mean, it's just like, let's think about if we were in control, well, would it be necessary? Would we do it this way?
I think, one of the problems of burnout, I guess, or feeling that you're entirely responsible for whatever happens in the workplace, and then being kind of massively kind of crushed and disappointed when like things don't work out the way you want them to, is really, it's a massive risk. And I think there needs to be a bit of a kind of self-reflection and feeling that, you can't change everything and you can just only do what you can do. And when you're with your workmates and you're having those kinds of conversations and you're putting forward like an idea of like, okay, well, yeah, we're all complaining, but, maybe if we did this, do people want to do it? I mean, it's up to people to decide whether or not they want to do it with you, and you can obviously kind of try and have those conversations and get more people involved so they feel like they're kind of stronger together. But ultimately, people kind of have to decide about what kind of risk they're willing to take and whether they're willing to stick their neck out a little bit. And that's really their decision. And so the role of a kind of militant in the workplace, I guess, would be to just put that mirror up, and be like, well, there is a kind of avenue here where we could do something. You can't make false promises. At the same time, like nothing will ever change if we don't do anything. And just to kind of present it to people like, well, if you want things to stay the same, then we just won't do anything. And I think having that kind of, a bit of a distance in those kind of situations, in the kind of intensities of like work contexts, that's really, it's important to remember.
It's also not our role. I mean, it's like, obviously it's good to encourage people. It's good to say like, hey, we can do that. It's good to have examples where other workers under similar conditions have done something similar and they had it as a positive result. But in the end, it's about, self-organization. If it needs you as a leader to take them by the hand, then that won't be a strong struggle. And it won't be kind of an experience of, power. It will be just like, okay, I followed.
I know, but I think also in the book, it's not quite as simple as that, because it's like if you've got a really weak workforce or a really unconfident workforce, they don't know their own power, they don't have any experience of like winning anything, then that kind of the temptation, I guess, to do a bit of that leading work, because I know when I became a union rep, I kind of had to do that quite a lot, like I was the one organising the pay protests outside work, pushing for the kind of £1 an hour pay increase and all of that, and trying to get people to kind of get involved, thinking, okay, like it just needs a bit of a kickstart at the beginning, and as long as you're kind of transparent and make meetings open and make sure it's clear that everyone has the equal right as everyone else to say something, then something organically can develop out of that. So that's also
that's fine. That's cool.
You mentioned, Kieran, that you were working with the trade union at one point, and the term syndicalism came up at one point. Can you both talk a little bit about the sort of three different models that were experienced and expressed in this book of more official labor organizing? The IWW obviously was organized with at one point to have a legal framework in order to engage with as a rank and file union, as has been described. That's a union that probably most of the listeners to the show will be familiar with. And we definitely have larger trade unions in the US that manage, struggle, and try to keep the bosses happy. Talk about those three models and weaknesses of them and sort of what a class union might be.
Yeah. I don't know if we would say that there are three models. I think, our starting point is each situation needs, an analysis by workers for workers. And in some situation you can, it makes more sense to have an informal, action. For example, in the chill warehouse of a supermarket, we were working as agency people, 0-hour contracts, and there was no real chance to get a permanent contract. The permanent workers were only They were the ones that were represented by the union. A lot of our co-workers would only stay there for 4 months. We were already there for 8 months. So at some point we said, okay, we have a slowdown and demand like at least 3 guaranteed shifts per week, because otherwise they can use the fact that they can give us shifts arbitrarily. They use that in order to push us into higher and higher productivity rates. So that was a situation where it wouldn't have made sense, to join the union. We did it actually, but like we were the only agency guys in the union, and the union was not interested. It wouldn't have made sense to introduce the IWW at that point, because it would have been like union competition, and these guys were only staying there for 4 months. So we thought, okay, we do informal action. And then we had a lot of exchange with our comrades in Poland and Italy who go along a syndicalist road. And do you want to talk about that?
There are some really good syndicalist unions, and so there's this one called Sicobus in Italy, and they managed to organise thousands of warehouse workers from like North Africa, and this was really kind of mafia type structures and really kind of bad conditions, and they managed to enforce some like massive victories over a period of years, and we went there to go and kind of discuss with them. Just to kind of find out, okay, like what actually is going on here, and can we just replicate this in West London? I mean, there's loads of warehouses in West London. We just need to copy what they do, and we'll have like massive strike waves over here. But obviously, the context and situation is totally different, and this is what we're interested in, like how and under what kind of conditions do certain things work. And when we ask them questions about, okay, under what conditions are you winning and where are you losing, it was very difficult to kind of get that honest information, even like comrade to comrade, because there's always this like organization that you have to defend, and always kind of proclaiming victories here, there and everywhere, because you want to attract more workers. And obviously that's important, but the danger is that workers kind of see the organization as the powerful vehicle rather than themselves. And over time, that kind of shift of power from like workers self-organizing to the organization, becomes self-evident. So, I mean, that's something that you have to be wary of. And it's very difficult, I think, as a syndicalist organization to not fall into that trap if you become kind of as big and successful as you want to be. Another thing is, it's all very well and good to say, okay, workers should, the union is the workers. And so we'll just do whatever the workers want to do. If the workers want to decide that they want to have seniority pay, because they've been working in a workplace like longer than the new starters, then okay, that's what they want. That's the union demand. But obviously that, becomes a problem because it divides the workforce. So politically, you think, okay, can the union afford to just be so like, led by the workers in that instance? Like there must be some kind of politics involved to have a kind of class line. So I think that's kind of where our kind of criticism of syndicalist unions would be, and that we kind of go into detail in the book about. And so that's why we kind of think a class union idea, which kind of brings a kind of a class line into a worker-led kind of organization. Like you need both sides.
Yeah, I mean, class union, it sounds like just a different label for the same thing. But I think Kieran touched on some of the problems with, let's say, something like an honest syndicalism that takes, the workers, basically demand is taken up democratically. I mean, we had a similar problem here with the IWW demanding a recruitment stop for delivery riders as part of the strike. And obviously, in the end, it's up to the workers to demand what they want. But we feel that we should defend a class line saying, like, at the moment, under Brexit conditions, with protectionism and all that, the whole nation discussed, we need a recruitment stop, which is closing the border, and that will change our condition. Whereas we would say, we don't mind if the boss recruits more workers, that's the boss's problem. It's not for us to say, like, the boat is full. So we want certain conditions, but we don't engage in the hiring process. So, yeah.
Yeah, as we said, I mean, we also used, we are members of IWW, and we used that when we did the organising drive, because it was a way to kind of find out about other workplaces that we hadn't previously had any contact with and try and get in touch with workers there, and also to get more people from the left on the other side of town involved. So, yeah, we weren't kind of purist about kind of not entering into the mainstream unions, because in my particular factory, for example, I mean, it was the only kind of option at that time, and workers were so unconfident, but most of them were in the mainstream union, which they didn't trust at all. But I found that actually once I became a rep, I had quite a lot of space to do stuff that I wanted to do, because nobody else was doing anything at all. And then by the time they cottoned on to the fact that I was a massive troublemaker, it was too late. So I think the idea is, you go to the workplace, it's a particular workplace, a particular group of workers, a particular way of that the work is organised, and the tools that workers can use in that situation are going to be different. But you just have to know what's in the toolbox, and use whatever you can to get where you want to go.
How much did this 6 years of this sort of organising build a wider community of trust that not that stands on its own, but that you all are intertwined with, of friendships, of relationships?
As we said, we arrived here with 3, 4, 5 people, and I think we managed over, let's say, the 5-6 years that we were here, to have at least contacts in probably 30 bigger workplaces. Now, I think that's it's part of a potential to work in a bigger workplace. For example, in the delivery or distribution center where I worked, a lot of the drivers would then move on to Heathrow or other bigger workplaces as drivers. So now I've got 2-3 people at Heathrow that I know as former colleagues, and normally maybe you would kind of message each other once a month, hey, what's happening? But now that the strike is going on at Heathrow, obviously these kind of contacts re-emerge, and they know that I'm interested, and so we exchange some news about the strike. And that was our main idea, really, with the solidarity network and all that, to have a kind of network of workers that maybe you don't see the immediate kind of need for it at a time where there's not much happening. But I think as soon as struggle picks up at either end, in a workplace or in society around here, I think these kind of structures kind of emerge, and they or re-emerge. So I think we've got 30, 40 people in a mix of workplace context and solidarity network that somehow relate to each other.
Also, a lot of people are just so chaotic. It's difficult, isn't it, to keep in touch with people?
Yeah.
The degree of personal problems. I mean, that's mentioned a bit in the part on family, but at the moment the crisis expresses itself a lot in personal crisis. I mean, that's especially where I work. It's the question of drug abuse, up family relations. It's big, but I think it's no easy answer.
No. I guess it kind of also depends who your workmates are, because when I was working inside the factory, and it was all these kind of older Indian women who basically just didn't have any social life apart from going to the temple or whatever, it was very difficult to have a
friendship.
To have you kind of have a friendship at work, but I mean, how deep can it go when I'm not married, I don't have kids, I haven't I wasn't born in a different country, I don't have. It was a very kind of different, coming from quite different places. So I mean, the workplace is very important in that kind of respect, because at least it was a chance to actually have relationships with people that you ordinarily wouldn't. You wouldn't.
Yeah, you had young Polish blokes kind of meeting older Indian ladies, whatever how much they speak to each other, but at least there was
obviously they're not going to be massive pen pals or something, but there was a way of you have to kind of somehow relate to each other on a level to kind of make the work easier and, you know, not so kind of mind-numbing.
Yeah, humans need play. Like, we... Otherwise our brains just totally dry up like a raisin.
Yeah.
But like, I mean, I think we maybe should abstract from the situation in West London a bit and ask ourselves, I mean, we look at the situation in the US much more than we look anywhere else, because we thought it's kind of all the contradictions and the crisis is deeper over on your side of the pond. But well, in a situation where you saw before the pandemic or during the onset, you saw various like smaller, like Kieran mentioned, smaller strikes, work stoppages. We don't really know how to categorize them, but like there was quite a bit of discontent about the health and safety standards and all that. And then you had the big uprising against the police violence, George Floyd uprising. And a whole new generation makes experience on the streets, like in the confrontation with the police, the question of, you know, how far can you go, question of violence and the limits of that. So you've got like the two souls of a movement still being quite a bit detached, like a structural power in, let's say, key sectors. And then on the other hand, let's say, marginalized workers or, you know, workers who experience the state mainly as an enemy, rather than, let's say, feel like that they're part of a collective workforce. So we wanted to discuss with comrades like how they see that situation, and we also ask ourselves as an organization, how do you relate to at least these two elements of, you know, class struggle that would have to come together. We could also introduce a third level, and we would think that might be something like the so-called intellectual workers, like doctors who are critical, or I mean, with the way that the state deals with the pandemic, or, you know, the Google or Amazon tech workers who, you know, don't like what their companies are doing, or engineers. So like that's a whole other section of the working class that is obviously also, you know, divided by in various ways from the rest. What type of organization would be necessary to connect the advanced points of these kind of struggles, and only then develop an idea of social change? Because out of each of the situation alone, this vision won't necessarily appear. You might be stuck in your company and then, let's say, company framework, or on a sectorial level, you might be cattled by the police, and you might be, you know, stuck in your tech office writing emails about climate change. I mean, all these things are fairly containable as long as they, you know, remain separate. So we need a political organization that is materially rooted in all these struggles somehow, isn't it, Kieran?
Isn't it?
In it.
Yeah, one thing about that surprised me throughout, like, definitely hearing about Whole Foods workers and Amazon workers at various parts earlier on, various points, these logistic, like, you know, grocers, for instance, but also logistics companies. And, you know, hearing about the strikes going on, or Uber Eats, or quote-unquote rideshare app companies, like in California, with the defeat of the apparent defeat at this point, at least, of the ability for drivers, like, I guess, zero contract drivers, sort of, to be able to unionize, or to be able to be identified as being workers as opposed to independent contractors. You know, that definitely that's a thing, like pointing to the precarity of certain types of work, and the fact that it's continuing to go on even during this disease, this pandemic. But also, I'm surprised that there hasn't been more of a row about slaughterhouse workers in the U.S. Just because hearing all the stories of even just recently, you know, managers having pools about who's going to die of the pandemic among their workforce, and a lot of those workforces are people of color. A lot of them are immigrants. It's overwhelmingly one of the most dangerous industrial jobs in the U.S., poorly paid, and yeah, it's incredible.
Yeah,
I mean, we talk a bit in the book about struggles in food factories and food manufacturing, including kind of and slaughterhouses. and trying to look at what the kind of common threads were in terms of the workers that actually started a struggle or a dispute and those that didn't. And, we were also quite surprised, like during the pandemic, well, actually not so surprised, but, there hasn't been that much in food factories. And considering that they are total corona hotspots, you would think, okay, something would happen there. But one of the kind of prerequisites to workers kind of coming together and doing something was like if they had some experience of organising beforehand, I think it's kind of easy to think, oh, corona is happening, we're the most vulnerable workforce at the moment, why would we put up with this, let's do something. If you're a workforce that has been totally kind of been beaten and bullied like up until that point, why would that suddenly change overnight? I mean, obviously it could, because things happen in leaps and bounds, but I think it's slightly unrealistic to think that workers will just immediately and totally spontaneously organise themselves. There needs to be some practical relations and trust between workers in order, really, like 9 times out of 10, for like something to happen. So I think, it is notoriously difficult, and we go into the book in quite a lot of detail about why specifically these kinds of low paid but essential work is so toxic. It's about bullying, it's about kind of work discipline, control, the kind of sophisticated techniques that management uses to keep workers down in these kinds of jobs, really have to be grappled with when you're thinking about, how to bring workers together and how to do something with your co-workers. And I think we're seeing that now. I mean, if we had some kind of organised workers and workplaces before the pandemic, then we would be seeing a much bigger increase of disputes happening now, and we're just not. And that is very telling about the kind of how the poor state of workers' power in this country. Yeah,
I slightly disagree. I think we see an increase in disputes at the moment, but it's still pretty much in control of the union apparatus. And with the slaughterhouses, I mean, there we had quite a lot of actions in Germany, for example, and in the UK as well. And I think it's mainly also because it's a male and more skilled workforce compared to like the food factory where you worked. I mean, it's different if you're like a butcher, and you know that roughly, I mean, that you can't be replaced tomorrow. Whereas if you're an assembly line, I mean, okay, if you do the samosas in your factory, you might not be replaced tomorrow, but like, I think there's still like a different skill element. And I think even Trump knew that, because he said, okay, these slaughterhouses in the South are basically essential industries, and he wanted to impose a strike ban, basically. So I think there was a lot of pressure there from the state. And then, as you mentioned, like if there are a lot of migrant workers, all of a sudden you've got the migration police there, it's kind of an additional kind of element of a hindrance to action.
I know, but the point is, like, the slaughterhouses in the UK haven't gone on strike since the pandemic, have they? Because their wages are already much higher. And there have been some cases of walkouts and wildcat strikes in some meatpacking factories in the UK over the last kind of 5 or 6 years. And I agree, that's, because they are more skilled workers. But my point was that kind of groundwork needs to be done.
This is The Final Straw, and you're listening to my conversation with Kieran and Marco of Angry Workers. Yeah, and I'm not meaning to blame the workers in those scenarios for not rising up and whatever. Like, I definitely see that they're facing a lot. But it was more, I was just trying to observe that there just hasn't been more of a row in general, like in the United States, to news getting out of the difficulties that they're facing, Yeah. But
yeah, seriously.
What are y'all working on now, and what do you think the next steps are to scale up workers' control?
Our idea was that, with the pandemic, we see on one hand an increased confidence of, let's say, essential workers, key workers like nurses, food manufacturing workers, distribution, and so on, because they've seen their key role during that period. on the other hand, there's an impact of the crisis, increased unemployment. So we see a pressure on, let's say, their confidence or wage demands from above. And we try to understand this kind of tension. So in order to do that, we started like an interview series with workers about their experience during the lockdown, like who actually enforced certain changes at work. Was it just like done by management, or was it like workers who either had to improvise or demand health and safety? Was there more discussion about the actual nature of the job? Like, is it, worth the risk? Do they really need our job here? And also coming out of the pandemic, a discussion about, how do we deal with the current attack on wages, and seeing like so many job cuts in mainly aviation industry, but also in other, automobile at the moment as well, like a lot of job cuts. So we wanted to use that also in order to bring these interviews together in a pamphlet that we could use in disputes like at the moment at Heathrow Airport, where it is about like the tension. On one hand, you have a very developed level of social productivity. On the other hand, you've got a crisis that might throw people back 30, 40 years in terms of their living standards. At the same time, you've got like this kind of wider question during the pandemic: what work is actually necessary? Plus, you've got the climate crisis. So that also in Heathrow, it's an immediate kind of issues. If not the climate, then definitely the pollution levels, where everyone who lives close to Heathrow can tell, like, how bad it is. And that's mainly the low-paid workers who live there. So we sort of trying to kind of develop all these, mention all these kind of contradictions and asking the question, if we're not able to, really defend our pay here, and have the control over the struggle, which at the moment it's not. If you look at, for example, there's a lockout-strike at Rolls-Royce. They do like turbines, a lot of for aviation. The union calls only 80 out of 500 workers out on strike for whatever reasons, but the strike doesn't seem to be in the control of workers. So here we can combine the question of how do we lead struggles that are under our control and only therefore effective, with the question like, this is not just our individual problem of our company. If we really want to have enough strength to fight back, we have to really connect these various struggles that are going on at the moment. And, it's a dozen or so struggles. So it asks already the question of coordination beyond trade union boundaries, because it's all done by different unions, beyond professional sectors and so. So this becomes like an immediate necessity of the struggle itself. In all this, we can then ask the question, okay, why are we in a crisis at all? I mean, this is a man-made crisis, so to speak. What about general social control? So I think that only makes sense if you're actually somehow rooted in all this. So there it comes in that, more of our comrades have to do some groundwork. So we can't just kind of shoot in and say like, hey, we've got some wacky ideas. You have to be part of these struggles and open the space for that type of discussions. So I think that, at the moment we can see the kind of tension of, on one hand, developing something like an idea of a collective social takeover of the means of production. And to see that this is not like something that can be done from, your government that you vote, because we've seen here in the UK and in the US that this kind of avenue is closed fairly quickly. At the same time, it is a pragmatic thing that is mainly in the hand of these kind of key workers, but they have to be supported. It's kind of something that where, marginal parts of the working class or the, let's say, the intellectual workers that we talked about, play their role. So I think at the moment there's scope to discuss that with a collective takeover of means of production. It would be easy to reduce working hours to, let's say, a 3-hour day. I think that's a fairly kind of thing that people could see as a possibility, which then would give us more scope to discuss the big problems, like how do we transform social production so it's not like fucking up the life of future generations, and how can we undo all the divisions, developed areas, underdeveloped areas, and so on. So I think these kind of things come out more, but they come out of the necessity of the current struggles to get a power base. And yeah, that's what, with our little modest thing of, interviewing a lot of workers and being part or trying to, be part of these struggles. That's, our hope at the moment.
You use social productivity twice.
I use social productivity twice.
We're counting.
Oh, I could, yeah. Let's get the editing suite working there.
You could blast a big vuvuzela whenever he says
Me.
I've got the air horn here.
Yeah.
I know I don't do it as well as the Antifada folks, but
Okay. Cool.
So are there any y'all have talked about and documented in the book, like the importance and what you've learned from relationships with unions in Italy and in Poland? You've talked about the industrial workers of the world a bit. Are there any sort of like networks of the scope that you sort of talked about in that last response that you're aware of in the world that people can maybe like look to for some inspiration? Anything going on in Southeast Asia, for instance, or in the subcontinent?
Well, there's definitely a lot of stuff happening. I mean, India is a lot kind of, you've got the farmers movement, which all its contradictions, big farmers, small farmers, some landless. Yeah, I mean, things are going on. We are in touch often with like individuals or very small collectives. I mean, there's something like an international network. We tried to organize a meeting in Greece, but that had to be cancelled due to Corona. But yeah, and I'm also not like, so we had like quite a bit of exchange with people from IWW in US, but that has, over the last at least year or so, that was not so intensive. No, we're interested in what's happening with the base building kind of tendency in the US and all that, but maybe it would be good to organize some kind of exchange or maybe an online discussion with people from the base building tendency about their understanding of, what it means to get rooted. I mean, there's probably certain differences in terms of emphasis. We emphasize, the workplace a bit more due to various, more political reasons. I mean, that would be something, but I don't think we can do that now here. It would be better to have a kind of dialogue or discussion about it. So I would suggest just...
Well, thank you so much, both of you, for being in this chat and for writing the book. Where can people get a hold of Class Power on 0 Hours, and how can they follow continued work by you on any social media or websites that you've got going on, and engage if they are some of these people that are involved in workers' struggle and wanting to contribute to the conversation that you're participating in?
Well, you can buy the book, Class Power on 0 Hours, from the PM Press website. And at the moment, they're doing 50% off, so it's a good time to buy the book. We have a plethora of websites. So we've got the Angry Workers website, we've got the Let's Get Rooted website, we've got the Workers World West website that has all of our past newspapers on it. We have Facebook, Angry Workers World. We're on Twitter, Workers Angry. And
we've got an email address.
Woohoo! angryworkersworld@gmail.com. And yeah, we're always kind of up for having a discussion, a meeting. If you want to write something about your thoughts on the book after you've read it, if you disagree with anything, then it's all for the collective debate. So we'd appreciate your thoughts.
Awesome. Well, again, thank you both so much for participating in this conversation, and I hope you have a lovely evening.
Yeah,
thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
This is The Final Straw, and I'm Bursa Goodness. This show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions and suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net or thefinalstrawradio@protonmail.com. If you'd like to use any episode for your project or radio show, feel free to do so. Just send us an email to let us know. If you care to, you can send us letters at The Final Straw Radio, P.O. Box 6004, Asheville, North Carolina, 28816. This show is brought to you by Firestorm Books and Coffee. Located at 610 Haywood Road, Firestorm Books and Coffee is a worker-owned co-op in Asheville specializing in offbeat, underground, and independent literature. You can find a catalog of Firestorm's books and zines, plus a full calendar of events up at their website, firestorm.coop.